This is Resident Evil 4. Today, it's one of the most, if not the most, acclaimed Resident Evil games. At the time, it received a 96 out of 100 average rating according to Metacritic, and its remake received a 10 out of 10 from GameSpot. Here's what our reviewer, Kurt, had to say about it.
I can't stop playing it.
And most importantly, Resident Evil 4 saved the entire Resident Evil franchise, and this is how. While Resident Evil was a fantastic game, by 2005 and after 12 games, the formula was starting to grow stale. And it was things like, well, this. Opening a door, cue door opening loading screen, and look, even Luigi's Mansion was copying it by this point. Yoo-hoo! The thing is, ever since Resident Evil 1 released in 1996 and defined survival horror as a genre, horror games inspired by it began to rapidly emerge, with most of them proudly wearing their Resident Evil 1 inspiration. 1998's Parasite Eve, Resident Evil meets Final Fantasy. 1999's Silent Hill, Resident Evil meets psychological horror. 2002's Eternal Darkness, Resident Evil meets Lovecraftian horror. 2001's Fatal Frame, Resident Evil meets a camera. 1999's Dino Crisis, Resident Evil meets dinosaurs. The first Resident Evil set the stage for the genre, but its sequel took the series to staggering heights of critical and commercial acclaim. Resident Evil 2 sold a whopping nearly 5 million copies on the PlayStation 1 alone. To put that in late 1998 context for you, Gran Turismo was the highest selling game on the PlayStation 1 with 10 million copies sold. So, RE2 was one of the standout successes of the original PlayStation's entire lineup. But like a freshly bitten zombie victim, the survival horror genre eventually started to fall apart in many ways, and there was a decline in both interest and ideas. Newer games like Fatal Frame, while getting a niche audience, were failing to succeed in a major way. Meanwhile, established franchises like Silent Hill were faltering. And even the mighty Resident Evil was on its way down. After creating a genre, the Resident Evil franchise meandered through emerging trends, and Capcom threw out more than a couple Hail Mary attempts at reinventing it with various offshoot games, and the main numbered games were starting to feel a little repetitive. But fortunately, Shinji Mikami, the original creator of Resident Evil, and many on his team at Capcom were themselves sick of making the same thing over and over again, and felt it was time for a massive change. I'm talking completely stripping down the fundamental mechanics that made Resident Evil, well, Resident Evil, and making Resident Evil still Resident Evil, but not Resident Evil. Hold on, I just confused myself. One of the things that made Resident Evil was its static camera. Every scene had a slightly different camera angle, and it allowed the developers to play with framing to enhance the atmosphere of the game. For example, they would make the camera crooked to induce a feeling of something being off, or put it in a specific location to block you from seeing enemies around the corner. In other words, it helped add to the tension of the game. On top of that, because the camera was static, it meant they could use pre-rendered backgrounds and walls, making the game look far more realistic than it otherwise would have on the limited PlayStation 1 hardware. This was also the case in the GameCube remake, which seriously still looks good today. RE1 made the GameCube hit the gym and finally stop skipping leg day. But the idea with Resident Evil 4 was to change things up, and Shinji Mikami would be inspired by a game that was in a series that was, ironically enough, inspired by Resident Evil, Onimusha 3 Demon Siege. Ninja Resident Evil. Onimusha 3 is a third-person action game, and notably, the viewpoint in the game is the standard third-person action perspective at the time, from far away in the distance so you can see everything going on. But why? Why is it so far away? What the hell? The game would be so much better if the camera's placed closer to the character, or maybe even like right behind the character, slightly over the back of the shoulder so you feel like you're right in the action. The game could have been so much more! Or so Shinji Mikami felt while he was playing the game. You see, he wasn't actually inspired by what the game was, so much so as he was inspired by what he wanted the game to be. So, in his new Resident Evil game, Mikami placed the camera right behind Leon and over his shoulder. And believe it or not, this had never been done before, anywhere. at least not nearly as effective as this. Before Resident Evil 4, the game that action games were, at the time, heavily inspired by was Max Payne, a game that had its camera set higher and further back from the character. Some of the most popular and successful games, like Ninja Gaiden, had a similar camera because the developers wanted you to be able to see what was happening. So, when Resident Evil 4 did this with its camera, it was truly revolutionary. This single camera placement change completely changed the course of gaming forever. Without RE4, you don't get Dead Space. Okay, that one was kind of obvious low-hanging fruit. Let me try again. Without RE4, you don't get Gears of War, a game that creator Cliffy B admitted was directly inspired by Resident Evil 4 and paved the way for an entire generation of over-the-shoulder action shooter games. It was basically Resident Evil 4 with a cover system. Without RE4, you don't get games like Mass Effect or Batman Arkham Asylum or their subsequent fantastic sequels, at least in the way we know them today. The ripple effect of this camera system went beyond Resident Evil and impacted the entire games industry. Of course, this new camera system was combined with a brand new aim mechanic. Remember, this is classic Resident Evil aiming. You can point the gun straight, up at the ceiling, or down at the ground. Even though you're in one of the most prestigious and elite special forces units called STARS, this is how you aim. I'm just saying that apparently you didn't need target practice to join STARS.
Okay, Dave, now aim for the head. No, the head. Try again. Dave, the head. Head! Damn it, Dave! That's the most beautiful aim I've ever seen.
While from a practical standpoint, the characters had terrible aim, from a survival horror standpoint, it made the game more scary. Take it away, Susie.
What makes the shooting really effective in Resident Evil 1 is it's, one, automated, or if you're playing the original release of RE1, manual aim, which is extremely hard to do from a fixed camera perspective. But yes, also that fixed camera perspectives, not being able to see what you're shooting at most of the time, and it makes for a really enjoyable horror game. So that's the goal. I think they nailed it.
So for Resident Evil 4, Shinji Mikami did the unthinkable. He made it so you had full control over your aim.
Wow, you're so dominant.
This madman was taking the fundamentals of what made Resident Evil scary and systematically stripping them away. Spooky cinematic static camera angles? Nope, we have a new camera system. Out with it. Difficulty aiming and extremely limited ammo? Nope. Leon can now fully aim from his behind-the-shoulder camera and make every bullet hit the mark. It was a giant risk, and amazingly, it paid off. Because while the tension couldn't be created by hidden zombies who were just out of sight from the camera, or, aiming at the ceiling when you want to shoot a zombie's head, instead, RE4 could use all sorts of new tricks to scare you as a player and add a different kind of tension, mostly thanks to... Imagine this, if you will. You're playing Resident Evil 1. You walk into a village area with 15 different camera angles, terrible aim, and you get ambushed and swarmed by like 30 plus zombies all at once. You are dead. It's over. There's no way you'd survive this. But in Resident Evil 4, as you have more control, you could do this. Suddenly, Resident Evil 4 was able to add in what's now, in my opinion, one of the most iconic moments in all of gaming. A moment where, at the opening of the game, just as you think you're starting to get the hang of the new controls and mechanics of RE4, it ambushes you with a zombie apocalypse. And if you weren't sweating profusely and screaming like a maniac when a dude with a motherfucking chainsaw suddenly appears and rips your head off, well, you aren't a human. Because that's the human response to this.
RE4 really relies on positioning and awareness of your surroundings, because while you do have a lot more control and capability in that game, you're still operating on tank control logic. So in both planes, so movement and aiming, it's a more frantic horror.
And that was just one of the ways the game tackled horror, with a brand new emphasis on action horror and with its zombies. I'm sorry, I've been saying zombies and that's a lie. What I mean is... Yet another way Resident Evil 4 updated its horror to complement these new mechanics was all new enemies who weren't zombies, but would still terrify the player and cause tension, even though you're now Action Bo Jackson Leon Kennedy with cool hair I wish I had. Suddenly, there's chainsaw dudes who don't die even when you shoot their faces with a shotgun. Suddenly, what you thought were zombies aren't. I mean, it's right there at the beginning of the game. It ain't a zombie. Instead, they're ganados, or villagers, infected by Las Plagas, who occasionally do this. Meaning shooting their heads is sometimes a very, very bad idea. Then there's creative enemies like Gyarados, who are blind but have giant claws and bum rush at any sound they hear, and still manage to absolutely terrify.
My favorite, scariest, grossest enemy in RE4 has to be the Novistadors that you find in the sewer of the castle / dungeon. Having 5 to 10 of those guys like right in your face, like just flying around and like skittering around in front of you and kicking you across the room and then jumping on top of you and melting your face off, and then you see the melted face, like it's terrifying.
So the enemy design was scary. And beyond that, they were able to deal with your newfound power. And speaking of newfound power, there was yet another thing the RE4 team implemented in a secret lab that wasn't even talked about until way later. If you were good at the game, secretly, the game got harder. Because let's be real, if you're overly good at something, that ain't scary. So the Resident Evil 4 team added dynamic difficulty for the sake of keeping the player from getting comfortable. Also, if you weren't very good at the game got a little easier, so hey, a little something for everybody. And here's the thing, Capcom still hasn't acknowledged that Resident Evil 4 uses dynamic difficulty, so pretend this section of the video doesn't exist, and it's our little secret. Yet another notable change to RE4 came from its writing. Resident Evil 4 is notorious for going absolutely over the top with amazingly cheesy one-liners.
My favorite one-liner in the original RE4 is right after the Krauser knife fight, right before you fight U3, Sadler calls you on the phone and he can't remember the name of U3, so he just refers to it as it.
It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps.
It's so stupid.
Where's everyone going? Bingo? I knew you'd be fine if you landed on your butt.
I was starting to get worried.
Don't you mean lonely?
Just because you killed my small-time subordinate.
Sadler, you're small time.
Wanna know something interesting about it? Come closer. 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 This wasn't in the Japanese version of the game. That's right, something that helped make the game pop in the West was put in by a translator. You know that famous bingo line I just showed Leon say? Well, in Japanese, the text for what he says is donateru, which roughly translates to what's going on. So, you know, non-existent. So what I want you to do is put yourself in a 2005 mindset. The year is 2005. Resident Evil 4 is just released. You've heard of the survival horror series, but interest in the popular games has waned. But what's this? The new Resident Evil 4 is being shown in gaming magazines, and it looks like something completely new and completely different. What's crack-a-lackin', home skillets? Usually horror games are wiggity whack, but this new Resident Evil game is the bomb.com. Let's peace out and play that biatch. Booyah! Resident Evil 4 didn't just cater to horror fans, it also catered to action video game fans. And beyond that, as the game was so revolutionary, it was interesting to gamers as a whole. It was something completely new and absolutely revitalized interest in the Resident Evil franchise as a whole. So in 2005, Resident Evil 4, a game that was kinda Resident Evil-y, but also kinda not Resident Evil-y, came out. To glowing reviews and monstrous sales. Between the PS2 and GameCube, the game sold a whopping 3.9 million units, and that doesn't include the 2007 Wii version, which would raise sales to 5.9 million. This was the best-selling Resident Evil game since RE2. With the appeal of survival horror dying, Resident Evil 4 brought an all-new dose of relevancy to the then-dying genre. 2009's Resident Evil 5 went on to sell 9.84 million units during its initial run, beating out RE2, and on this one, I think we can all agree it was thanks to the popularity and success of RE4. Remember, before Resident Evil 4, every game following Resident Evil 2 had sold less and less units. Resident Evil 6 sold over 10 million units during its initial run, unfortunately. Suddenly, a franchise that was slowly but surely sinking had once again become one of the most successful and popular franchises out there. And if you like horror, RE7 brought the series back to its horrific roots with a game that, as much as I truly love RE1, honestly scared me more. And also, it sold over 11 million copies. Resident Evil Village, to date, has sold over 6.4 million, and Resident Evil 2 to 3 were remade in the vein of RE4 to positive reviews and sales.
Yeah, the impact RE4 had on the series and the gaming industry as a whole is that it just changed it. It changed everything. I mean, like, I remember I watched a video from someone who I can't recall right now that also brought up how, like, every game is Gears of War. And it's like, no, every game is RE4. Like, RE4 invented that camera system, and its impact is still being felt to this day. You don't really get a whole lot of games like that, where it's so groundbreaking and so innovative, not only for its time, but for as many possible years to follow.
Survival horror, in the tradition of Resident Evil 1, were fantastic games. While there are still occasional games like Signalis being released, modern horror games have completely shifted to new trends. Most of the old school survival horror franchises have just petered out. However, we all still know Resident Evil, and that's not a fluke. It's not just because Resident Evil 1 and 2 were popular, or because it had a terrible series of movies I'll never understand the appeal of. Silent Hill's first film adaptation was far better. Shame on all of you. Resident Evil 4 carried the torch for Resident Evil through a slowing of interest in survival horror. It completely revitalized the series, introduced it to new fans, and was able to pave a path for Resident Evil until its next big comeback into popular relevance with Resident Evil 7. But you have to wonder, if Resident Evil 4 hadn't happened, would there be a Resident Evil 7? Or would Resident Evil have become Capcom's next Mega Man? In that is a series I love, but Capcom has mostly abandoned.
Resident Evil 4 might be divisive for some, but I think there's no doubt that it saved the Resident Evil franchise.
Thank you so much for watching the first episode of How It Saved. It's actually one of many shows we're launching here at GameSpot, which is super exciting. Another one that I highly recommend you check out is The Kurt Locker, hosted by our very own Kurt and Davina, which takes a look at the role that gaming plays in our lives. To celebrate launching these new shows, we're also doing a giveaway, so check out the pinned comment for info on how you could win Resident Evil 4 Remake, Jedi Survivor, or even a PlayStation 5. US residents only, terms and conditions apply. Also, a huge thank you to Susie for adding her steep RE knowledge to this episode. Please make sure to check out and subscribe to her channel, The Sphere Hunter.